All right, cockers, it's Ken, spilling the beans on bygone bangers. Well, hello there, you magnificent lot. It's your old mate, Ken Weller here. Some of you might know me from knowing a thing or two about cars that rattle, roar, and occasionally, spectacularly, fail to proceed. I've spent more years than I care to admit, probably more than the Queen's had corgis, mucking about with engines, kicking tyres, and generally getting oily in places you wouldn't show your doctor. I've seen fads come and go, automotive Goliaths rise and fall, and more dodgy MOTs than a bent politician has had hot dinners. Today I want to have a bit of a chinwag about a particular slice of motoring history. 2 decades that promise so much, yet now seem to be fading faster than a cheap paint job in the British sunshine. I'm talking, of course, about the 1960s and 1970s, a time of questionable trousers, even more questionable haircuts, and cars that, depending on your persuasion, were either the absolute dog's bollocks or rust buckets waiting to happen. For many of us of a certain age, shall we say, these were the cars plastered on our bedroom walls, the heroes of Sunday afternoon telly, the aspirations parked on our neighbours' driveways. They were European mostly, because back then buying British or something from the continent felt right, patriotic even, or at least sensible. But times, as a certain crooner once warbled, they are a-changin', and the love affair with these 60s and 70s icons seems to be hitting a rather bumpy patch of road here in the UK. Now, don't get me wrong, I've got a soft spot for some of these old girls. A well-sorted Ford Capri can still make my heart do a little flutter, and the sheer audacity of something like a Lancia Stratos, even if most of us only ever saw one in a magazine, was pure automotive theatre. But passion, it seems, isn't always enough to keep the wheels turning in the classic car market. There's a chill wind blowing through the garages where these 60s and 70s chariots are stored, a distinct lack of enthusiasm, and prices that are, frankly, looking a bit saggy. It's a curious case, and one I've been pondering over a pint or three, as you do. So buckle up, buttercups, because old Ken is about to take you on a little journey. We're going to delve into why these once celebrated European machines from the 1960s and 1970s are starting to lose their luster in Blighty. It's not just about rust or dodgy electrics or even the lingering smell of stale tobacco and disappointment that some of them carry. No, the main culprit, as I see it, is something far more inevitable, something that affects us all, even if we try to ignore it with ever more expensive hair dye and ill-fitting lycra. It's a story of changing times, changing tastes, and, crucially, a changing of the guard. Let's get stuck in, shall we? The 1960s and 1970s. Decades that fashion forgot, but ones that gave us some truly memorable European cars. Or at least, cars that we remember, which isn't always the same thing. Let's be honest, for every sleek Italian sports car or robust German saloon, there were legions of truly dreadful tin boxes that rusted if you so much as looked at them funny, but even those had a certain character. Back then, a new car on the drive was a statement. It meant you were doing all right, you were moving up in the world. It wasn't just transport, it was aspiration wrapped in often quite luridly coloured metal. In Britain, we had our own heroes, of course. The Ford Cortina was king of the sales charts, the working man's chariot, dependable as a digestive biscuit. Then there was the Escort, particularly in its RS Mexico or RS 2000 guise, bringing rally-bred excitement to the masses. And who could forget the Ford Capri, the car you always promised yourself? It was affordable glamour, a slice of Americana filtered through Dagenham. British Leyland, bless its chaotic heart, was churning out everything from the plucky Mini to the wedge-shaped Princess. And the MGB was still just about clinging on as the quintessential British sports car, even if its roots were firmly in the 60s. These were the cars that filled our streets and our dreams. Across the Channel, our European cousins were also busy forging automotive legends. The French gave us the quirky and brilliant Renault 5, a super mini that was chic before chic was even a thing for small cars. Citroën, as ever, was ploughing its own furrow with hydropneumatic marvels like the GS and CX, cars so advanced they probably baffled their own mechanics. The Italians, well, they did what they always do best style. Fiat's 127 and 128 were clever, front-wheel drive runabouts that sold by the bucket load, while Alfa Romeo and Lancia offered machines with soul, passion, and admittedly a tendency to dissolve in the rain. Even the Germans were getting in on the act, with the likes of the Opel Manta offering a European take on the pony car. And right at the end of the decade, the game-changing Volkswagen Golf Mark I arrived, setting a template that everyone else would follow. These cars weren't just lumps of metal, they were part of the fabric of life. They took us on our first dates, to our first jobs, on family holidays to rainy seaside towns. They were companions, sometimes frustrating, often unreliable, but always. The smell of vinyl seats on a hot day, the specific click of a door handle, the roar of a carburetor-fed engine. These are sensory memories deeply embedded for a whole generation. This deep-seated connection, this powerful nostalgia, is precisely what fueled the classic car market for these vehicles for so long. They were quite simply the cars of our youth, and we wanted them back. Fast forward to today, 2025, and the picture for many of these 1960s and 1970s European classics in the UK market is looking, shall we say, less than rosy. It's not quite a full-blown crash, not yet anyway, but there's a definite sogginess, a distinct lack of vigor. It's like turning up to a party, expecting a roaring celebration and finding three blokes nursing warm beer and a deflated balloon. The heady days of rapidly appreciating values for almost anything with a 60s or 70s birth certificate seem to be behind us. Certain models, the truly rare or exceptionally iconic, are still holding their own. But for the bread and butter classics, the ones that were once relatively attainable, the enthusiasm has waned considerably. You see it at classic car auctions, where once a half-decent Ford Cortina Mark III or a tidy MGB GT would spark a bidding war amongst misty-eyed enthusiasts. Now they often struggle to meet their reserves. Dealers are reporting slower sales, cars sitting on forecourts for longer, and a general reluctance from buyers to part with their cash unless the vehicle is absolutely perfect and priced very, very keenly. Online marketplaces tell a similar story. Plenty of listings, but many of them lingering for weeks, sometimes months, with owners gradually chipping away at the asking price in the hope of tempting a buyer. It's a far cry from the feeding frenzy we witnessed just a decade ago for these very same machines. Even the big classic car shows, while still popular, seem to have a different vibe when it comes to the 60s and 70s stuff. There's still admiration, of course, but it's often tinged with a sense of, "Ah, yes, I remember those," rather than, "Crikey, I absolutely have one." The crowds tend to linger longer around the pre-war grand tourers, the sleek 60s sports cars, or even the more modern classics from the 80s and 90s, which are now having their moment in the sun. The 60s and 70s metal, unless it's something truly exotic like a Lamborghini Countach or a BMW M1, often gets a polite nod and then people move on. The urgency, the burning desire just isn't there in the same way. This isn't just pub talk or idle speculation, mind you. People who track classic car values professionally, the sort of chaps who live and breathe auction results and private sales data, are all pointing to a softening in this particular sector. It's a gradual cooling, not a sudden freeze, but the trend is undeniable. The cars that once represented the pinnacle of aspiration for a generation are now, for many, becoming yesterday's news. And the reasons for this are manifold, but one stands out head and shoulders above the rest, like a grumpy old man at a children's party. Right, let's get to the meat and potatoes of it, the absolute crux of why these wonderful and sometimes wonderfully awful 1960s and 1970s European cars are gathering dust instead of admirers. It's not because they've suddenly become terrible cars. They were always a mixed bag, let's be honest. It's not because they've all rusted away, though a heroic number certainly tried. No, the single biggest factor, the elephant in the room, or rather the elephant in the saga cruise brochure, is us. Or more specifically, the generation that grew up lusting after these cars. We're getting old, folks. The knees are creakier, the eyesight's a bit blurry, and the desire to wrestle with a non-power assisted steering rack in a cramped, un-air-conditioned cabin is, shall we say, diminishing. Think about it. The young lad who drooled over a brand new Ford Capri 3-litre S in 1978 is now, in 2025, likely to be in his late 60s or even early 70s. He's probably done his time, paid off the mortgage, and maybe, just maybe, he's got a bit of disposable income for a classic. For years, this demographic was the engine room of the 60s and 70s classic car market. They were reliving their youth, buying the cars their dads had, or the cars they couldn't afford when they were spotty teenagers. It was a nostalgia trip, pure and simple, and a powerful one at that. It drove prices up and kept restoration specialists busy. But what happens when that generation starts to, well, downsize? What happens when climbing in and out of a low-slung sports car becomes more of an orthopedic challenge than a pleasure? What happens when the focus shifts from tinkering with carburetors on a Sunday morning to enjoying a leisurely round of golf or spending time with the grandkids? The pool of active, enthusiastic buyers from that key demographic naturally begins to shrink. Some are sadly no longer with us. Others are finding that the practicalities of owning and maintaining a 40 or 50-year-old car are just too much hassle. They might be looking at their collection and thinking, it's time to let a few of these go. And this isn't just about physical limitations, it's also about changing priorities. When you're younger, the dream of owning a classic might involve weekend blasts down country lanes and polishing chrome in the sunshine. As you get older, comfort, reliability, and ease of use become far more important. A modern car, with its power steering, air conditioning, and infotainment system, suddenly seems a lot more appealing for that trip to the garden centre than a grumpy old Alfa Romeo that might or might not start. The passion might still be there, deep down, but the practical realities of aging start to outweigh the romantic notions of youth. Section 5, Nostalgia's Last Gasp, when memories can't shift motors. Nostalgia is a powerful drug, isn't it? It can make us yearn for things that, in reality, were probably a bit rubbish. It's the rose-tinted spectacles effect. For the 1960s and 70s European classic car market, nostalgia has been the fuel in its tank for decades. It was the driving force behind men, and it was, let's be fair, mostly men, of a certain age shelling out good money for cars that reminded them of their youth, their first loves, their first taste of freedom. A Ford Escort Mexico wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of youthful exuberance, of rally victories on the telly, of simpler times. A Fiat X19 wasn't just a wedge-shaped sports car, it was a taste of continental flair, of dreams of Sophia Loren and sunny Italian roads. But here's the rub: nostalgia is intensely personal and deeply generational. If you didn't live through the 1960s or 70s, if you weren't a car-mad kid during those eras, then a Triumph Dolomite Sprint or a Renault 17 TS probably doesn't pluck at your heartstrings in the same way. It's just an old car. Maybe an interesting old car, but it doesn't carry that same emotional weight, that same irreplaceable connection to your own past. And as the generation for whom these cars deeply nostalgic gets older and moves on from active classic car ownership, there isn't an equally enthusiastic younger generation queuing up to take their place, at least not for these specific vehicles. The children of the Capri generation, those now in their 30s and 40s, grew up with different automotive heroes. Their bedroom walls were adorned with posters of Porsche 911S from the 80s, Ferrari Testarossas, or perhaps Japanese super saloon heroes like the Subaru Impreza and Mitsubishi Lancer Evo. Or maybe it was the hot hatches of the 1980s and 90s, the Peugeot 205 GTI, the VW Golf GTI Mark II, the Renault Clio Williams. Those are the cars that evoke nostalgia for. They remember their dads driving an Austin Montego, not an Austin Allegro, and frankly, they're not desperate to relive that particular experience. So you have a situation where the primary enthusiasts for 60s and 70s European metal are aging out of the market, and the incoming generations of classic car buyers are looking elsewhere to different eras, different styles, different memories. The emotional connection, which is so crucial in the classic car world, because let's face it, you don't buy these things with pure logic, is weakening for 60s and 70s machines. The stories, the personal histories entwined with these cars are fading from the collective consciousness of the active buying market. It's like a band whose original fans are no longer going to gigs and the kids just aren't into their old tunes. Section 6. Euro classics on the wane from Cortinas to question marks. Let's get specific for a moment and look at some of these European stalwarts from the 60s and 70s and how they're faring. Take the humble Ford Cortina. For decades, a Mark 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 in good nick was a solid bet, a car that everyone's dad, uncle or dodgy neighbor seemed to own. They were plentiful, parts were easy to come by, and there was a huge well of affection for them. But now, You'll still see them at shows, but the prices for average examples have stagnated, and only the very best Concours condition cars or the rarer performance models like the 2000E command serious money. The everyday Cortina, once the backbone of British motoring, is finding it harder to find a loving new home. Then there's British Leyland. OBL, a byword for, well, many things, not all of them complimentary. But they produce some cars that, despite their flaws, wormed their way into the nation's heart. The MGB, a design icon from the 60s that soldiered on through the 70s with rubber bumpers and diminishing charm, still has its fans, but values for the later models are modest. The Triumph TR7, the infamous wedge, once touted as the shape of things to come, now looks more like a shape that many would rather forget, unless it's a rare V8-powered TR8. Even the more mundane BL offerings, the Allegros, Marinas and Princesses, which were once ironically cherished, are now struggling to find buyers who see past the well-documented build quality issues and rust problems. What about our continental cousins? The French flair of a Renault 12 or a Peugeot 504 saloon, once common sights, now feels like a distant memory. While a mint Renault 5 Gordini or an Alpine A110 will always be desirable, the more bread-and-butter Gallic offerings from the 60s and 70s are niche, to say the least. Their complexity, potential for rust and sometimes tricky parts availability for UK-specific models put off many casual classic enthusiasts. Similarly, Italian cars from the period like the Fiat 124 Sport or the Lancia Beta, beautiful and characterful as they were, carry a fearsome reputation for corrosion and electrical gremlins that scares away all but the most dedicated or foolhardy Alfisti or Lancisti. Even some German cars, usually a byword for solidity and appreciating values, are not immune. While an early Porsche 911 or a BMW 2002 from the 60s and 70s remains blue chip, more mainstream models like the Opel Ascona or Ford Taunus, the Cortina's German cousin, don't ignite the same passion or command the same prices as they might have a decade ago. The exceptions, of course, are the truly groundbreaking models like the original VW Golf GTI, which has achieved legendary status, and its prices reflect that. But for many of its contemporaries, the market is undeniably softer. The stardust is settling, and what's left is the reality of owning an aging, sometimes temperamental piece of European motoring history. Section 7, the young pups. Different dreams, different drives. So, if the chaps who grew up dreaming of a Ford Cortina or a Ford Granada GXL are now more interested in a comfortable mobility scooter, who is buying classic cars? And what are they buying? Well, it's the next generation, or even the generation after that, and their tastes, surprise, surprise, are different. The kids who were born in the 80s and 90s, who are now in their 30s and 40s with a bit of spare cash, they're not misty-eyed about Allegros or Avengers. Why would they be? Their formative automotive experiences were shaped by entirely different cars, different sounds, different cultural touchstones. These younger enthusiasts are often drawn to the cars they saw in films, on television, or in video games when they were growing up. Think max power culture, think early Fast and Furious. This means that 1980s hot hatches like the Peugeot 205 GTI, Volkswagen Golf GTI Mark II and Renault 5 GT Turbo are hugely popular. They're relatively quick, fun to drive and have a retro cool image that appeals. Then there are the Japanese performance cars from the 1990s, the Nissan Skylines, Toyota Supras, Subaru Imprezas and Honda Civic Type Rs. These were the poster cars for a whole generation, and now they're becoming increasingly collectible and valuable. It's not just about performance either. There's a growing appreciation for modern classics cars from the late 80s, 90s and even the early 2000s that are now old enough to be interesting, but still new enough to be relatively usable and reliable. Think of the early Mazda, MX-5, BMW E30 and E36, or even some of the more interesting mainstream cars that survived in good numbers. These cars offer a classic experience without necessarily requiring a degree in mechanical engineering or a second mortgage to keep them on the road. They often have better parts availability and are more suited to occasional daily use if required. Furthermore, the way younger generations engage with car culture is different. Social media plays a huge role. Instagram and YouTube are full of younger enthusiasts showcasing their modified 90s Japanese imports or their pristine 80s German saloons. The Radwood phenomenon, celebrating the culture and cars of the 80s and 90s, is a testament to this generational shift. For them, the 1960s and 70s might as well be the Jurassic period. It's not that they actively dislike 60s and 70s cars, it's just that those vehicles don't resonate with their own experiences or aspirations. The nostalgia simply isn't there. And without that emotional hook, a 1965 Ford Anglia or a 1975 Vauxhall Viva just looks like a very old, very slow car. Section 8. Keeping these old girls alive. A wallet-emptying palaver. Let's be brutally honest for a moment. Owning any classic car, regardless of its era, requires a certain level of commitment, patience, and crucially, a reasonably healthy bank balance. But keeping a 1960s or 70s European car on the road in 2025 can be a particularly challenging and expensive endeavor, and this is undoubtedly another factor dampening enthusiasm in the market, especially for those on a tighter budget or with less mechanical aptitude. These aren't modern, computer-controlled machines that you just service once a year. They demand constant attention, like a needy toddler with a spanner. Firstly, there's the dreaded rust. The tin worm. Many European cars from the 1960s and 70s weren't exactly built with longevity in mind, especially when it came to corrosion protection. British cars of the era were notoriously susceptible, but even some of their continental counterparts could dissolve at an alarming rate if exposed to a damp British winter. Finding a truly solid, unrestored 60s or 70s car is becoming increasingly difficult, and rectifying serious corrosion properly is a costly and time-consuming business. A new wing here, a sill there, maybe a whole new floor pan, it all adds up, and quickly. Then there's the issue of parts. While some popular models, like the MGB or Classic Mini, have excellent aftermarket support, finding specific bits for less common 60s and 70s European cars can be a real headache. Trim pieces, obscure electrical components, specific engine parts. You can spend weeks, even months, scouring online forums, auto jumbles and specialist suppliers, often paying a king's ransom for a new old stock part or a decent used item. This parts chase can be fun for some dedicated enthusiasts, but for many it's just another barrier to ownership. Another reason to look for something a bit easier to maintain, and let's not forget the mechanicals themselves. While many 60s and 70s cars are relatively simple by modern standards, they still require regular fettling. Carburetors need balancing, ignition timing needs checking, and various oil leaks often need, if not curing, at least managing. Finding mechanics who are truly familiar with and sympathetic to these older technologies is also becoming harder. Many younger technicians have only ever worked on fuel-injected, computer-managed engines. So unless you're handy with the spanners yourself, labor costs for specialist work can be eye-watering. All these factors combine to make the prospect of 60s and 70s classic ownership less appealing, especially when compared to younger classics or even modern performance cars. Section 9. So what's next for these 60s and 70s survivors? The love affair with many 1960s and 70s European classic cars in the UK is, it seems, cooling down faster than a cup of tea left out in a January blizzard. The primary culprits, an aging fan base whose knees are giving out, a new generation of enthusiasts whose hearts beat for different automotive eras, and the ever-present challenges of keeping these often cantankerous old beasts on the Queen's Highway. It's a bit of a shame, really, because for all their faults, the rust, the iffy electrics, the questionable styling choices, these cars have character, something sorely lacking in many of today's anodyne motoring appliances. Does this mean it's curtains for the Cortinas, the Allegros and their continental compadres? Not entirely. There will always be a core group of dedicated enthusiasts, people who genuinely love these cars for what they are, warts and all. And as prices for some models soften, it might actually make them more accessible to a new, perhaps younger audience who are looking for an affordable entry into classic car ownership and appreciate their quirky charm. Perhaps the very best, rarest or most iconic examples will continue to hold their value, or even appreciate becoming museum pieces or prized possessions for serious collectors. For the vast majority of 60s and 70s European classics, however, The future probably involves a gentle decline into more niche appeal. They'll become curiosities, reminders of a bygone era, cherished by a smaller, more focused group of fans, no longer the darlings of the mainstream classic market, but still capable of bringing a smile to the face of anyone who remembers them from their heyday, or anyone who appreciates a car with a story to tell. It's the natural cycle of things, I suppose. Tastes change, generations move on, and what was once cutting edge eventually becomes a charming, if slightly creaky, antique. And on that slightly melancholic, yet hopefully not entirely depressing note, that's all from me, Ken Weller, for now. I hope you've found my ramblings on the state of the 60s and 70s classic car market somewhat illuminating, or at the very least, mildly entertaining. If you did enjoy this little automotive autopsy, do me a favour, Give that like button a good old prod, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe for more pearls of wisdom, or possibly just more grumpy opinions from yours truly. It costs you nothing, and it keeps an old codger like me feeling relevant. Cheers and happy motoring, whatever you drive.